Over the past few hundred years, we've seen technology becoming increasingly sophisticated and powerful. It's a fairly obvious statement. I want to explore whether adding computers to everything, which in reality is what this technological advance usually means. I want to explore the idea that just adding computers to everything is not actually a sign of progress or advance at all, but it's just, in many cases, technology for the sake of it, a sign of a society that's rather lost its way, in fact, that cannot see that just because some technology is good, more technology, more sophisticated technology must always be better. That's not always the case. I want to use the idea of technological obesity, that much of the added technology, much of the added computing is not technological muscle, but in fact technological fat. It's obvious that technology has been of enormous benefit to us. It's also obvious that there has been a significant negative element in the adverse impact on the environment. In this video, I want to see whether we can identify areas of life where increasing sophistication in technology is not adding anything to our lives, may in fact be detracting from our lives, and therefore any negative impact on the environment which is generated by that technological sophistication has no justification at all. Now, as a semantic note here, I want to be very careful about using words like progress, technological advance. Now, both of these not only have the idea of movement, or it's a fairly obvious metaphor when looking at the way technology has changed, but these terms, advance and progress, they both have the idea inherent within them that this movement is towards the good. And it's this element that I'm questioning here. Therefore, right from the beginning, I want to make sure that I'm detaching, and I would encourage you to detach as you're thinking about this, detaching increasing sophistication, increasing complexity in technology from the terms advance or progress in technology. Now, I'm going to explore these ideas through an analysis of motorcycles, viewing the issue through the lens of motorcycles. The reason for that is because I'm particularly interested in them. And I'm going to explore the question whether modern bikes are genuinely better than old ones, or are just the unthinking addition of more and more complicated technology, often in sort of computing type additions. The addition of this was simply because we can. What I'm then presenting as a technological obesity in these bikes, and some of them are just huge. So is this technological obesity or technological muscle? And this analysis could apply equally to other machines and technology that we own. Cars is a pretty obvious one, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, etc. Now, I approach this as someone who's pretty competent at home mechanic, but emphasis there on mechanic. One of the things I'll be focusing on is the increase in increasing inclusion of electronics, of digital, of computing in everything that we own. Our cars have now what is essentially computers within them. Even our washing machines have computer type elements included. Now, this is a particular concern of mine because whereas I would happily take a motorcycle gearbox apart and be able to put it back together again and it works, if I opened up an iPhone, and just getting inside them isn't exactly easy, if I opened up an iPhone and looked inside, I'd be pretty clueless as to what to do with anything in there that I could see. And I think that's probably something that many people would identify with. Now, there's plenty of addition of technology, development of technology, which can be seen as advance. I don't want to rule out all of it at all. What I want to do is look at balancing off two sides of an equation, one of which is ease of use, and there's no question at all that that's the case with much modern technology. But ease of use, and then on the other side, I want to look at other factors, built to last, and that idea built to last has numerous implications. One of these is the eco footprint of something. Now, by this, I don't just mean eco footprint in terms of, say, measuring emissions at the exhaust pipe for a vehicle, or measuring the energy consumption during use for, say, a washing machine. I want to look at this in terms of placing that piece of technology on a much longer time scale than is normally looked at for an eco footprint. So I'm, say, looking at 500 years, even 1,000 years. And so I want to look at this in terms of the digging up the raw materials out of the ground, right through the mining process, the transport of that, the manufacturing process, and all the ecological implications of that process. Right through, so manufacturing and then use of the machine, and then every element of that taken beyond the end of use of that piece of machinery, that piece of technology, until every element of it is back into the ecosystem for potential future use in some way. Now, this means we need a real understanding of what happens to something at the end of its life. So not just thinking in terms of, oh, I put it in the recycling. That, as far as I'm concerned, is not really adequate, because the real question is, well, what happens to each individual element of the machine at the end of its life? What happens to it once it has been put into recycling? Looking at disposal, looking at getting every aspect of that technology, every component of it back into the ecosystem and available for further use. So that's this idea of circular economy. And a major factor in this idea of built to last is the question of repairability. Looking at whether something is so complicated that it's only going to be maintained, well, if at all maintained, instead of being thrown away and replaced, it's only going to be maintained by some highly specialised technician with very specialised knowledge and equipment. And therefore, that's going to equate to expense. And therefore, if you've got a very expensive repair, the chances are you will just simply buy new and throw away the old, because replacement is, even if it's not actually cheaper, it's only marginally more expensive. So whether something's been built along those lines, possibly even with built-in obsolescence, or whether something's been built to last, built with the intention of the competent home DIYer, or maybe high street repair shop being able to keep this thing going, to maintain it. And the image I've got for you there is that's me repairing the Henry vacuum cleaner. I mean, wonderful machines in terms of their ease of repair, availability of spare parts. It's certainly built to last. I'll start this exploration by looking at this 1939 Velocette MSS. It's a 500cc bike. It's an OHV engine. And therefore a thoroughly modern bike for that period. Very high quality engineering. Many people happily use bikes like this for many years as their main form of transport. And in fact, as far as I'm aware, this actual bike spent from 1939 to 1946 in the British Army. It's clearly a bike that can deliver the goods. So would I want this bike now as my main form of transport now? Well, the simple answer is no, I wouldn't. You know what? I like rear suspension. I like front suspension that delivers a little more than this, the girder forks on this one. I like lights that actually put out some light at the front end so you can ride at night. The 6-volt system on this bike is pitiful. I like brakes. stopping distance on this bike? Well, you know, possibly. The half hub single leading shoe brakes are woefully inadequate as far as I'm concerned. I love this bike. It's a great hobby bike. It's one of the reasons I like it, is that it's completely maintainable by the competent home mechanic. It's wonderfully simple, straightforward engineering. And this is a central issue in this exploration of increasing levels of complexity and sophistication in the technology. It's that ability of the home DIYer to maintain and repair the technology on which our modern lives depend. Now, much as I love this bike, I consider that anyone who is wanting this 1939 Velocette level of technology, it's just what would we call Luddite. It's an excess of nostalgia. And as I say that, I've got to be aware that there may be people who would consider the point I want to stop at is also just me being a Luddite and suffering an excess of nostalgia. So that's really a sort of question. I'm putting that down to say I'm aware of this. That's any response would be appreciated on that. So I've got to flag up then this obvious danger with the line of argument that I'm putting forward. I want to be careful as I go through this video that I'm not just an old bloke nostalgic for the bikes of yesteryear when life was so much better and so much simpler. Actually, I'm not convinced life was that much better. It's probably simpler in many ways, but I'm not convinced it was that much better. And I wouldn't want to go back to this 1930s, 1940s era of engineering for my bike or car or washing machine or the aircraft I'm flying in or medical technology. So staying with bikes I've owned as I continue to introduce the ideas I want to explore, I've had 3 Triumph 500s. Not as these weren't nostalgia hobby bikes, these were just because that was what we used to buy then, and these were bikes I could afford. So I had a 1955 5T, then the more modernised version, the 1964 5TA, and then pretty well the end of the line for that particular 500 was the 1970 T100 SS. Oh, basically the same bike, and all with some technological progress as they advance. And I want to argue that that was genuine progress on those. Progress from that 1939 Velocette, and in fact there was the first of those Triumph 500 twins was 1938, so more or less the same era as that Velocette. So let's have a look at this 1970 T100 SS, so 30 years on from the Velocette. I owned this when it was about 5 years old, and there were some vast improvements over the Velocette. Sort of decent suspension all round, so the handling was okay, hugely improved brakes, twin leading shoe front brake, still cable operated drums though, 12 volt electrics, so you could get a reasonable amount of light out of the front end, and still very repairable by the home mechanic. Would I want to stop here? Would I be happy with this level of technology? Well, that's not as simple a question as it was with the 1939 Velocette. And what I want to do with the rest of this video is to see if I can start to put together a route map which would take us through a detailed and nuanced exploration of this idea of excessive and potentially harmful use of technology, the idea that we're suffering from technological obesity. Let's widen out the vision from motorcycles to look at the late 60s more generally, and I want to pick on just 2 significant events in technology. The first I want to look at is Concorde, a joint project between Aerospatiale and BAC, first flight 1969, and then of course the really big one, Apollo 11 moon landing 1969. Now, just if you remember this period, just cast your minds back, or if not, just try and imagine being there. There's still 30 years to go before the 21st century. The 21st century at that time had this sort of magical feel to it. It was the future. And the future in 1969 doesn't feel like the future now. Looking at the progress, and I do mean progress, over the previous 30 years, it was entirely plausible that all that sort of science fiction 21st century, the flying cars, the route, holidays to the moon, space stations, we were going to Mars, all that stuff. Much of it you would probably describe as, the Jetsons 21st century. But the important thing is, in 1969, that was not fantasy. There was a real possibility, a real sense that actually in the 21st century, if technology advances at the same rate, that's what we could be experiencing. Now, there's an idea which I think has got a lot going for it, which says that the late 60s, early 70s was some sort of peak, cultural peak possibly, certainly technological peak. It ended a very dynamic and creative period in the West. And so this idea goes, from this point onwards, the West moved into a period of what could be understood as stagnation, as decadence. In one direction, this can be taken, it can be found in Ross Douthat's concept of decadence, and he lays this out in his book, The Decadent Society, how we became a victim of our own success. Or you could just do a YouTube search on Ross Douthat to find him explaining his thesis. Now, I don't want to link my idea of technological obesity that I'm exploring here too closely with Douthat's idea of decadence, as I think it works as a standalone concept. It could, however, be seen as part of a wider phenomena in the contemporary West, and would certainly fit with Douthat's idea of decadence. So staying with that late 60s period of Concorde and Apollo 11 and moving back to motorcycles, putting on the table alongside my 1970 T100 SS another couple of bikes contemporary with it that I didn't actually own. The BMW 5 Series, picture here is the 750 5. A 5 Series was launched in 1970. And the Honda 754, CB754, which was launched in 1969. Now, the BMW 75 series, that's definitely my sort of bike. Didn't actually own one, but I've ridden bikes very similar to it. Now, would I be happy if this was the bike I had to own, if motorcycle technology had remained at this level? Well, basically the answer is yes. Probably the brake system I might look at and think I wish it was a bit better. But, and this is very important for where I'm going, hydraulic disc brakes were around in the late 60s, just not at this stage fitted to BMWs. Looking at the basic concept of the BMW layout of a horizontally opposed twin shaft drive, it's a fundamentally much better engineering concept than the Triumph Twin. It has started life about the same time as the Triumph Twins, and like the Triumphs, you'd have this slow evolution until with the Triumphs you've got that my 1972 100 SS and the others similar to it, the Bonneville of the same era, the Trophy. A slow evolution, and you end up with BMWs with this 5 Series. The vibration problems on the Triumph, that 1938 Edward Turner design, they're just inherent in that bike, in that engine. They were still there in the 1972 100 SS, and they were still there with the late 1970s 750 Triumph Twins that I owned. You were very aware that you were riding a 1930s engine, no matter how tarted up and polished it might be. That's not the case with the BMW. The BMW was just a fundamentally much better designed engine. Okay, let's move then from those, looking at them having evolved from the 1930s, and we've got the Honda CB750-4. This is a transverse inline overhead cam 4-cylinder engine. It was absolutely revolutionary. This hadn't evolved steadily over the decades as the Triumph and the BMW had. This was just launched onto an unsuspecting world, and it set the pattern for a huge proportion of larger bikes since then. It came out in 1969. This was definitely a bike for moon landing year. So let's move back to bikes I've owned and develop my exploration of how much technology do we need, how much technology is adding genuine muscle, and how much of this technology is technological obesity and just adding fat. So onto my 1981 Moto Guzzi T4. It's an 850cc OHV twin. I bought this new to replace 1977 T3, which was essentially the same bike. I've also owned a couple of 1980s Guzzi V50s, the 500 version, and in terms of discussion of technology, again, essentially the same bike. They were just slightly smaller all round. Now, I want to argue that this represents the generation of bikes, roughly 1970 to 1990, that I'm presenting as a high point of engineering development. I'm not convinced there was anything added during that period that was worth adding, which was not present in 1969. So the idea I'm putting forward here is that the peak was hit in 1969, and the following 20 years was just about bringing everything up to the level of what was cutting edge technology in 1969. The most obvious example of that was hydraulic disc brakes. So let's just focus down then on the T4. This was my main form of transport, and I covered thousands of miles on it in all weathers with total reliability. So what had it got? Well, if we just reflect back to that Velocet, well, this has got entirely adequate, really very good front and rear suspension, really good handling. This has got 3 disc brakes. This one could certainly stop hydraulic discs. It's got 12-volt electric, powerful 12-volt electric, a huge battery in it, and you could, powerful headlights, you could put out enough light at the front end that you could ride at night nearly as fast as you could ride during the day. Now, it's got indicators. The lack of them on the T100 SS was actually primitive, even by 1970. Standards Triumph weren't noted for really keeping up with all the latest developments. The Guzzi's got electric start, kickstart wasn't even fitted, excellent weather protection. The fairing systems by that period were really very good. This is just as I'd bought it new. I hadn't actually fitted the bottom sections of the fairing at this stage. It's got excellent luggage carrying capacity with those detachable cases, and it's got an engine powerful enough to carry 2 people fully loaded with luggage at 80 miles an hour and still feel perfectly relaxed. And very importantly, this generation of Moto Guzzis was still an entirely home mechanic friendly bike. So the images here, this is the engine out of the frame. I can't remember what I was doing. I think I was replacing the clutch on this. This is an 850 engine, very, very straightforward to work on. But when all the bikes so by the 90s, by the end of the 90s certainly, probably the beginning of the 90s, when all bikes had that level of technology, that 1969 level of technology, all of which I'm suggesting were genuine improvements and therefore genuine advances and progress. So when they'd all got that, well, after that, the manufacturers really had run out of, as far as I'm concerned, real improvements. But manufacturers, of course, want to continue giving the impression of development, the impression of progress in order to sell new bikes. So I'm suggesting then that after this there was an increasing tendency to just add technology just for the sake of it. It was new, yeah, it was new, but was it of any value? That idea of technological obesity, adding technology that was not producing genuine benefit. Now, to develop this exploration, I want to look at BMWs from what I consider to be that golden era, the sort of the 80s and 90s, as that 1969 cutting-edge technology was consistently applied to all models. And I want to compare bikes, BMWs from that period, with those of the 2019 range. Now, I've chosen BMW because they have a reputation for high quality engineering and a consistent range, making comparisons fairly easy. I think the 2019 BMW range is a perfect illustration of over-sophisticated technological additions which generate as many problems as they add value. So I'm using that 2019 BMW range to illustrate this idea of technological obesity. Now, the BMWs I want to look at are the Tourer, the R100 RS, and then the 2019 R1250 RS, and the off-road adventure style bike, the R80 GS, and the 2019 R1250 GS. So let's look at some of the basic data for these bikes. Now, fairly obviously, these modern bikes are far more powerful. That's not disputable at all. The real question is whether all that extra power is usable. So what do you want it for? Is it there just because it looks good on the performance numbers? It makes you feel good because you know you've got a more powerful bike than other people? Or is it power that these BMW owners are genuinely using on a regular basis when they're out on their bikes? Now, of course, what we're doing here is looking at those power figures, comparing 2019 bikes with bikes which are now 30 or 40 years old. Now, to make a genuine comparison, to make my point, which I'm guessing you can't actually do, is imagine what those older bikes would look like had they been refined for 40 years. That is, it was what I'm saying, they're perfecting them at as is, but perfecting and maximizing that design. So the question I'm asking is whether that performance that's there, the 50 brake horsepower out of the GS 800, the 60 out of the larger engined R100, is that power in any way inadequate? These are much lighter bikes, of course. Is that power inadequate in terms of what 95% of riders are doing with their bikes 95% of the time? Has there been any genuine and usable gains from all those additions over that 30 years which produced these much bigger, much heavier bikes with hugely greater power from much bigger engines packed full of sophisticated electronics? So the image I keep coming back to, are these huge modern BMWs? Are they big muscle bikes, or are they just simply obese? Now, as we get into the details of my analysis, it's clear that my primary focus is the level of technological sophistication on these modern BMWs, and very specifically the electronic equipment, the computer element with which they're fitted. Now, a major source I'm using for this video is the BMW Motorcycle Story by Ian Falloon. That's an excellent book. I can certainly recommend it to anyone who's interested in motorcycles and motorcycling history. It's a detailed history of the BMW motorcycle right back from the origins and takes us up to the 2019 range. Now, I'd like to pull out a sentence of that from that book from Falloon about the new range. And he says, "It was a big ask to improve the legendary R Series GS. But BMW knew their clientele, and they knew GS owners would always want a new and improved model. Now, very clearly, this 29 series is new. But the question I'm interested in exploring is whether it's genuinely improved or merely new. And as I said before, I want to present this as a set of questions because I want to ensure I'm not just simply being an old bloke who's suffering seriously from nostalgia and wanting the bikes he rode when he was in his 20s. Now, in my defence here, I want to clarify, I'm not nostalgic for the bikes I rode when I first started, so teens and early 20s. You know, I don't want to go back to those 50s and 60s Triumph Twins that I used to ride then. What I am looking at are those bikes from the 1980s, in other words, those using 1969 technology to its full. And it's those I'm suggesting were the pinnacle of motorcycle development and potentially represent engineering technology development more widely. So let's have a look at some of the features these 2019 BMWs have. Some of these are standard, some optional, but that's not relevant really to the point I'm making here. So these new engines, they've got shift cam variable valve technology. Okay, it's an electrically activated shifting gate linked to the throttle, which determines camshaft selection. So you've got different cam profiles available for different power requirements. There's one which is called a safety feature, and it's the fly-by-wire throttle. So there's no throttle cables on these, it's all electronic. And what this does, it automatically shuts off the throttle under hard braking. There's one called Hill Start Assistant that automatically holds the brake on when stationary on an incline. I've never ridden one of these and I really can't work out how that one functions, but there it is. And then you've got the riding modes where you set this up. It's got road and rain. It's got something called automatic stability control. And then it's got optional riding modes pro. That just means it's a more sophisticated riding mode system where you can tailor it to your own personal needs. And then it's got this one, which of course is just epitomizes all that I dislike about this sort of bike. It's got its 6.5-inch TFT multifunction display for the built-in computer. So major question really from this list: does the addition of this lot really add to the motorcycling experience, to the functionality of the bikes? And what may be the downsides of having this lot on your bike? Now let's present what I see as some of the potential downsides for all this technology. In other words, identifying the technological obesity. Now, major one for me is the issue of repairability. Who is able to repair these modern BMWs? Now, I'm a pretty competent home mechanic. I can strip bikes down without any difficulty, take a gearbox apart, work on top ends. Ooh, electronics, they're a whole different ball game. Now, an important question here, is this just me because I'm an old bloke, or is this quite common? Now, things mechanical you can see, they're much easier to understand. I've struggled on cars when I've had an indicated fault on a sensor and then eventually worked out that actually it's a sensor fault, not a fault with the engine itself, and I found that replacing the sensor is quite an expensive business. An anecdote about my daughter's Golf, which had computer problems, so she took it to the local auto electronics specialist, who after a few attempts gave up and sent her to the VW main dealer. A quote for fixing it from them, it was so high that she opted for trading it in for a newer car, which thankfully has behaved since. So the question really, are we losing the ability to repair our own bikes? And possibly even further than this, are we losing the ability to take our bikes to our local repair shop and forced to work with main dealers and their prices? I was worried about anything built on the basis that only the manufacturer is able to maintain and repair. Apple are masters of the art of doing this. So linked to this question of repairability is the issue as whether it's built to last. These are BMW, so I'm assuming a very high quality of engineering. But I want to draw a distinction there between the engineering. So would I be wanting to drive a 10-year-old ride a 10-year-old BMW, 20-year-old BMW. I'd happily ride a 50-year-old BMW because they are so well built. Do I want to buy and use a 10-year-old computer, a 15-year-old computer? How confident would I be in that? And I think that's a different question. So when you're buying your 10-year-old BMW, how dated will the computer technology be by that stage? What's going to happen when it goes wrong? Are you able to fix it yourself, or are you committed to using the BMW main agent? So you're paying absolute top price for your repair and maintenance on a 10 to 20-year-old bike. Now, an anecdote relates to this. A friend of mine who likes big German cars. He doesn't have much money. So at the moment he's driving around a big Mercedes, probably around 15 years old. The central locking went on the car. And so, you can see where this is going. He priced up how to fix his central locking, and the price of the central locking replacement was just way more than the value of the car. So his solution, he just never locks the car. He can do that because he lives out in the country. That's not really a solution for most people. And so that seems to me to be an example of what is quite likely to be the case. You've got a beautifully engineered Mercedes which will probably just end up being scrapped because the central locking's gone. The centre anecdote I was giving, that was on a Jaguar. That was about a 15-year-old Jag, beautifully engineered. Got rid of it because of the electronics, which were rendering it just too expensive to run because of the maintenance. And so have we got with these BMWs beautifully engineered bikes in terms of the mechanicals, but technologically in terms of the IT, that's what will let them down, because that will become prohibitively expensive to maintain. So we've got our BMW then, gets to 15 years old, packed full of electronics, which only the main agent can repair. And so the question is, and I accept I might be wrong here, there might be lots of blokes and women as well out there who may say, just no problem. I can get into a computer system and repair it. It's just as easy as taking the gearbox apart, fixing a clutch, fixing a drive shaft. But for me, when I look at the question of whether I want to own and therefore repair and maintain one of those 2019 BMWs when they're 15 to 20-year-olds, full of electronics, full of computers, well, for me, the answer to that is, well, just no. Can I imagine one of those 2019 BMWs being a functioning bike in 80 years' time? Well, the simple answer to that is no, I really can't. My guess is they will have been scrapped long before that, as far too expensive to maintain. Can I imagine one of those 1980s BMWs being fully functional when they're 80 years old, as is my Velocette? Well, I see no reason why not. They were engineered and built to last. And quite honestly, in one sense, there's nothing to go wrong on them. Well, nothing to go wrong that can't be fixed easily. And moving on to the eco footprint, which is a closely related issue. Look at those bikes from the 80s and 90s and their eco footprint. Now, as I said earlier, I want to look at that eco footprint, not simply measuring emissions at the exhaust pipe, but looking at the bike as a totality on a 500-year timescale. So extraction of raw materials and manufacture right through to the elements of the bike being fully back into the ecosystem and reusable. Those older bikes, very straightforward. They were made out of very basic materials, which means when it's no longer wanted as a bike, it can just be melted down. Okay, the plastic for those older bikes may be a problem, but really what I'm doing here is imagining them made now. So there's no reason that the plastic elements could not be made from completely recyclable materials. The eco footprint and ethical implications of producing electronics is very complicated. Also, recycling electronics is far from simple. To look at recycling properly, we need to look at beyond putting electronics in a recycle bin. We need to look at precisely what happens next. Now, my son, who worked in recycling for a few years, considered that recycling electronics often meant shipping them to poor countries where children use desperately dangerous methods to extract the valuable metals from the components to then be sold back into the manufacturing process. Now, how much of this is true is beyond my expertise, but I know enough to ask the questions and not accept glib answers when it comes to recycling electronics. So the question that would raise, and I've no idea how you would even do the calculations. Yes, those modern bikes comply with modern emission regulations, which are far more stringent than those 80s and 90s bikes. But if it's not just about measuring the exhaust pipe, but about its eco-footprint over a 500-year period, I'd be interested to see somebody who could do the calculations that demonstrated that those modern BMWs really do outperform those 80s and 90s style bikes when they're taken as a totality. Okay, this next bit could well be just me as an old bloke not liking all this modernity which has crept into motorcycling, spoiling the simplicity of motorcycling in my younger days. So I'll put that on the table before I start presenting these questions. Now, to me, riding a bike is quite complicated. I'm going to get philosophical in this bit, but that's what I do. Riding a bike is about being one with the machine. It's about identifying with it. It's about having a real awareness of what's going on. You hear, you feel the engine, you know what it's doing, you engage with the bike. It's almost a relationship with the bike as something living. You become completely familiar with it. You can feel the road coming back up through the tyres and the suspension. And also extending beyond the bike itself. Riding a bike is about full engagement with the environment that you're in. It's about looking at the road, reading the road, looking at the road surface, adjusting, riding to match the road and the conditions. It's a skill. It's a skill I pride myself in. I'm going to take a guess. Everybody thinks they're a good rider. I don't know whether I am or not, but I like the challenge. I like to study the art of how to ride a bike. It's that sense of skill I've learned, man and machine, taking on the challenge of the road and the elements. And as I look at some of the things that are in these modern bikes, all the electronics, setting the riding modes, I'm not sure I want that, because I want to be the person who's in control. Most people riding these BMWs have cars as well. The bike is how we express ourselves. There's clearly something about riding a bike which it's about who I am. These bikes, we ride bikes to engage at an existential level. You know, riding one of these BMWs because it's a functional means of transport. If I just want to get from A to B, you know, I'm getting my Ford Focus. Boring, but it does the job. So what I can't quite understand is why you would bother buying something which removes so much of that real engagement with what's going on and hand it over to a computer. The one that I suppose I'm most bemused by is this hill start assistance. I've never thought hill starts were that difficult. So why has that skill been taken away? Why is it even needed? And I suppose one of the things I'm concerned about is that maybe you could ride one of these bikes with far less skill than you would need to ride one of those older bikes, where if you want something doing, you had to do it yourself. If you want the road reading, you have to do it yourself. Is there the potential here then that we've got this enormously powerful bike, and any numpty who knows very little about bikes, can't read the road, doesn't know how to do a hill start, doesn't shut the throttle off when hard braking, and we're going to put these people on this sort of bike? Now, we're very definitely in the subjective here about why we're riding these bikes. And it's here I see this as a symbol of wider society. I want to look here at this idea of alienation. We are increasingly dependent on technology. Increasingly dependent on technology that really we don't understand. The number of people who can seriously engage with an iPhone, and by that I mean take it apart and fix it. The number of people who can do that with an iPhone. It's just tiny. Go back 30 years or so, and we used to be able to fix things. I have fixed washing machines before now. Now, when a washing machine goes wrong, it's probably something in the electronics in the control systems, and I just buy a new one. So increasingly, we're giving our lives over to technology that we don't understand, which takes over activities and functions which are about us expressing ourselves as humans. So I would suggest that these modern BMWs are contributing to a sense of alienation, the sense of loss of meaning. And surely why we ride our bikes in the first place is because of the meaning that they provide for us. So I'm worried with the level of technology on these modern BMWs and the technology elsewhere that we find in society, which I see as the technological obesity, which means we are losing far more than we gain from it.